start to train your mind and body today and make it as important as eating and sleeping.
Welcome to Ultra Habits. Here, we go under the hood with our guests to unpack the minutia and to understand what processes and systems they engage or research that result in ultra-enhanced living.
Mark, welcome to Ultra Habits, man. We are kicking off our second go at this. You and I had a chat last May, but there were some technical difficulties. But you know what? I don't mind talking to people twice because generally the second time's even better.
I agree. I've done it. Usually it's my own problem is the technical issue. You know, I've recorded a podcast that I forgot to press record. So technically I didn't even record it. So those are always fun to do over.
You know what? I find the technicals or the technology to be the most difficult part of the conversation. And maybe that's my age. I'm like on that borderline. I'm Gen Y, but I'm like more Gen X, I think. And I find the technology component actually the most difficult part sometimes of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Just so many variabilities, you know, internet speed, blah, blah, blah. But we are here. And I have to say, I love your work. I love the integrated warrior approach, mind, body, spirit. And I think we're in a culture where the grind message and the go hard and that polarized view of we need to push ourselves and get off the couch. I think I agree with that, but I think there's a whole another side of that we don't necessarily talk about enough. And that's why I love what you do and how you do what you do, because you really recognize the holistic approach to this performance piece, right? So I'm going to take it back, though. I just want to talk about how you came up, Mark. So I know that you grew up in upstate New York. I know that your dad had a love of the outdoors. I believe he was a bit of a hard ass, and your mom was an athlete. How did that impact you? And you know, what did you take from your childhood to adulthood in terms of how you grew up, the good and the bad? Yeah,
well, you know, basically growing up is shaping your identity. And identity is, you know, it comes from experiences. Experiences are essentially the input and the meaning you make, you know, the frames of reference and the memories that you store and how you choose to store those memories and what memories you choose to, you know, make part of your ongoing story and what you choose to ignore or suppress or repress or project, right? So, you know, I like to say now that essentially you're being trained from birth and you just don't realize it until you wake up and recognize it. Oh, shit, you know, someone else is training me. Culture's training me. My parents have trained me. My mind is shaped this way. My personality, my ego, everything is shaped in this very complex web of stories, and we call that your identity. And until you wake up to that and recognize that identity is often not your highest and best self's identity or your spiritual self's identity, which maybe has a different path or calling for you and a different way of being, you kind of get trapped and locked. And I was living that very path. You know what I mean? I was a common person, small town, 375 people in my town in upstate New York, and bumper community to Utica, New York, which was a declining industrial city. My father had an industrial plant there. I mean, that was a business that had been over 100 years old in the family for multiple generations. And of course, those multiple generations were filled with, you know, a lot of alcohol and a lot of, you know, negativity and stuff like that. But the business was still surviving. And, you know, it was employed 300 or 400 people. And certainly the expectation was, or the identity of the family was, that we're divines and we're a business family. And, you know, we do that. Because of that, we didn't struggle financially, even though there was certainly not an abundance mentality in my family, my mom or my dad. It's really interesting. I mean, we had resources, but it wasn't anything my father earned. You know, he was kind of handed it, the business. Now, he maintained it. He did his work. You know, he battled the unions. He battled the lawsuits. You know, he maintained the business. But I think he always never really felt confident or
Mm.
You know, and he had a childhood that was, abusive and traumatic. And so he felt a lot of kind of shame. And, he expressed that in anger and rage and drinking and whatnot. And so I lived with that. So because of that, and my mom was, very, very athletic. And, my dad was like the really good looking guy, and she didn't know quite what she was getting into. And, but she wasn't going to walk away from that once she got into that. And so she became kind of a codependent enabler and tried to hold the family together. One of the things that I loved about my mom's contribution is she really got us into sports. And I think that was largely to get us out of the house in the afternoon and to get us that discipline and athleticism. So it was really my mom who was into sports, not my dad. But my dad did love the outdoors, and we used to, we'd be outdoors a lot and, always kind of like chopping wood or mowing the lawn. And then in the summers, part of the gift of this family legacy was he inherited a summer kind of family camp on Lake Placid in the West Shore, no road access. So we would get off school and like the next day pile in a car and head up to this beautiful Adirondack Lake. And the Adirondack Parks in upstate New York, for your listeners, is 6 million acres of protected wilderness with over 5,000 freshwater lakes. And Lake Placid is like the winter sports capital of America. That and maybe Aspen, Colorado, or Park City, Utah could compare. But the Olympics were held there twice. I was actually at the 1980 Olympics. And so my front yard was a lake, and my backyard was this beautiful mountain range.
Wow.
It was awesome. No road access, no cars, right? And so we had boats, and it became a really good competitive water skier. My swimming, was very good because I was always on the water, in, on, under. And I used to love running the mountains of the Adirondacks. And, that led to me being a really effective endurance athlete because I was comfortable being alone, in the water. I was comfortable being alone, running trails. And so in a sense, the wilderness and that environment was my first training ground. Well, the first training ground was the family, which was conditioning me a certain way. And there was positive and negatives to that, right? The negatives was I got really shut down emotionally. The positive was I was tough as nails because you really weren't going to hurt me. And when I went to SEAL training, like, you couldn't hurt me because I was like, you got nothing on that beast of a man who was my father, right? So, and then from nature and being out in nature and running those trails and hiking the mountains and swimming in the lakes, I learned to be really comfortable with my mind. And so I developed an introspective practice early in life without even knowing what I was doing, right? No training or anything. At any rate, so I was smart enough and good enough at athletics to get into a pretty good college, Colgate University. And that was one thing also I really love about my parents. This is kind of expected that I was going to go to college, and they paid for most of it, like 95% of my undergraduate. So that was a huge blessing because not everybody gets that, right? Mm-hmm. Not everyone is expected to go, and so they don't unless they buck up and decide to do it on themselves. And I didn't have student loan debt from college. I did have it later on from my master's, my MBA, because I paid for that. So I went to Colgate. I swam competitively there. I ended up rowing crew competitively in the last 2 years and was in a fraternity, great guy, great bunch of guys. And, I kind of did that thing. And that led me to getting a decent job that took me down to Manhattan after I graduated with a company called Coopers & Lybrand, which is now PricewaterhouseCoopers, big company. And they were sending me with a group of people from, hired by other accounting firms and consulting firms that sent us to NYU Stern School of Business to get our master's in accounting. And then we would then be qualified to sit for the CPA exam. So there I was, kind of way over my head, I thought, because I was a pretty average student. It's not because I wasn't smart. It's because I was really, I really lacked confidence because of the way I was raised, in college. And so here I was, I was good enough to get into this great job in this great business school, but I was like, whoa, I didn't feel confident or competent. But here I was doing it, And so I go down there and I start working at Cooper's as an auditor. And then I'm going to school at night. And I wanted to keep up my physical. There was something about my kind of spirit, there's just like, okay, you're not going to let your body go into like this steady decline like I see in with the rest of the suits, you know, on Wall Street, where they're looking all pasty and kind of puffy. And I was like, there's no way in H that I'm going to allow that to happen. So I would get up every morning and go for a 6-mile run and do my little morning ritual, which included some journaling at that time and some introspective work. And this is 1985, by the way, so well before a lot of this stuff was talked about. At lunchtime, I would go to New York Athletic Club and bang out a high-intensity interval workout before I even knew what that meant. But I now see that's what I was doing because I had to get it done fast, right?
Yeah.
And I liked a lot of variety, and I just hated those machines. And so I just, you know, whatever I could do to break a sweat and move my body, you know, I would do it for as fast as I could for 20 minutes or so. And then in the evening, I had this time period where they would let me off at 7 o'clock or 5 o'clock. I had to be down at the World Trade Center at 7:30, where NYU Business School was. And so most of my peers would go home and have dinner and change and, you know, prep for school by doing some homework or something or reading. And I said, I look at that as a freaking training block. You know, look at that. I got 2 hours to do something. But what am I going to do? You know, I've already gone to the gym and I've already gone to run. So I don't really have time to go rowing or do anything fancy triathlon wise. So I was like trying to figure out what I would do. And I stumbled across a martial arts studio on the way home from school. And that's where I met my first true mentor, Mr. Nakamura, Kaicho Nakamura, who taught me how to meditate because he was a Zen master as well as a karate instructor, founder of the school, founder of the whole style. So I took to meditating back when no one talked about meditating, but this was a Japanese martial tradition. So Zen and, you know, the martial way was very, you know, that's a long tradition, right? So here I was in New York City, you know, practicing this martial art and sitting on a little wooden bench every day meditating. And I trusted Nakamura so much, and it felt familiar to me because of my experiences in the wilderness, right? Because when I would go on those long runs and those long swims and stuff, I would feel similar to the way I felt after a long sit. And so I was like, oh, this is great. I felt really good. And then the contrast between that and the cacophony of walking out into the streets of Manhattan was like very, very real to me. And so I was like, oh, that's good. That's good. Like that feels good. There's something about that is beneficial to me. So I stuck with it, RJ. And boy, I within 2 years, I could see this real radical transformation occurring in my mind. I was able to I was able to concentrate much more deeply, and Zen, like the path of Zen, really starts with concentration training, and then it leads to more of a metacognitive capacity to think about your thinking, to be able to separate yourself from your thoughts and emotions. And when that started to happen, which took about 9 months, you know, between 9 and 18 months of work, meditation work, I began to be able to see the story of my life almost as if I was watching a movie. And so instead of like being in the screen, on the screen, living that, like merge with my thoughts and emotions, it's almost like I was sitting in the audience and looking at my life. And I was able to kind of like poke holes in the story. I was able to look at that story in that movie of my life and be like, wait a minute, you know, I don't like that. What happened? I don't think that was a good decision. And why am I living this? Whose story is this? It's like, why am I even, you know, it's like, who's, this is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful life. What am I doing here? And so I was like, shit, I better ask him better questions. I've been asking the wrong questions. Because if this isn't my life, then what is? What am I supposed to be doing? Why am I on this planet? So I started to ask those questions during my meditations and after or before, and I started to get some answers. It started to come to me.
Did this teacher of yours, did he become, I guess, like a father figure, right? Like, did he give you elements of nurturing that you may not have had growing up?
I think that because of my father was stern and mean, and so it shut me down. And this guy was stern, but really loving. And so I slowly over time, it took years for me to really trust that he really cared about me. And it wasn't going to He wasn't judging me, because I think I internalized that sense of feeling judged. And so I just kind of projected that on him initially, even though he wasn't. And so that was very powerful for me to see someone who's really strong and completely accepting and open and non-judgmental and actually very light and happy and playful and spontaneous. All these qualities that I was like, wow, you can be both strong, stern, incredibly disciplined, and happy and playful and light and spontaneous and joyful. And I was like, well, that's really cool. I want that. Right. So that gave me a lot of motivation to keep training, both in the hard and the soft, both with the, on the dojo floor as well as on the wooden bench. Right.
You touched on something earlier about your father. I want to unpack it. Not so much about your dad, but just the principle. You said you grew up in a household of material abundance, but almost a scarcity mindset, right? So like, I guess that can happen in families that have generational wealth, because you don't necessarily have to evolve as an individual to accumulate that wealth. Like an entrepreneur that's kind of self-made, maybe, may have a tendency to focus on personal development because they are the ones that have adopted the stress to create that wealth. Now, that's an assumption. That's not necessarily always true. Right. But you're talking about a household with generational wealth, yet a mindset that doesn't kind of represent that level of abundance. That must have been tough, right? Because on the outside, it looks like everything is great and you should be happy. But you're not, right? And so what can you just focus on that? What was that like?
Yeah, that's a great question, RJ, because you're spot on. I mean, there is so much growth that accrues to someone who goes out there on their own and makes it on their own. This is why I was dead set. I am not going back to that family business, and I'm going to go figure this out on my own. You know what I mean? And that led me, of course, part of that, and combined with me having these experiences on the meditation bench that told me I was going to be a warrior or needed to be a warrior, led me into the SEALs. But then also after I got off active duty, I didn't go back to the family business, and I didn't go back to Coopers and Lyman or PricewaterhouseCoopers. I said, I want to be an entrepreneur, so I took the entrepreneurial path and started my first business. Largely because I had learned the value of the growth that accrues from overcoming challenges and really going out and, planting your flag in the world and following your calling and your purpose, right? That's really critically important. And I think that because of the way our systems are structured with, corporations that endure, beyond the life of their founders, leads to this generational wealth. And that can be really trap people, because the allure to stay is very high. All my siblings, there's 3 of them, are back working at the family business. And they're not particularly happy. But it's, as you know, it's hard. And as everyone listening know, it's hard to start a business. Like if it was easy, everyone would do it. It's hard. I've gone through 20 iterations, to get to successful business. I was counting them the other day, 20 different, you could call them all separate businesses, but they're like 20, probably maybe like 5 or 6 separate businesses, but the other 14 were like different iterations of trying to make that current business successful. Right? So that's just the way it is. It's hard work. But yeah, I mean, even just wealth. Like I have an acquaintance whose parents started, the biggest router company and sold it to Cisco for $500 million. And he went off and became, went into finance, but then he wanted to help out. And so he went back, and now he runs the family foundation, or the family office, they call it. Right. And he's helped them. They've helped him to grow their wealth to over $1 billion. And so his net worth is like $200 million, which is no small change. Right. And yet he does not feel wealthy at all, because he didn't earn it, and he won't touch it, and he doesn't pay himself anything. And so, my friends or peers and I were in this group with him. We're like, dude, have some fun. Right. You take credit for helping to preserve and to grow this wealth, but just feel good about what you're doing because you chose to do it. And if that means you got the resources to have some fun with this money, then do it, because you only live once. And there's a lot of people who would love to be in your shoes right now. So stop feeling poverty. Like I felt confused as a child because we lived in the biggest house in the town. And this is a tiny town, but like we literally were like, imagine those old, medieval towns where all the little houses around the castle were there to support the needs of the castle. Well, all the roads in this town that we lived in went around my house.
Wow.
And it was a National Historic Landmark. It's built in 1797, called Mappa Hall, named after Colonel Adam Mappa, who was from the Dutch Holland Land Company, who came over to help the revolutionaries on the side that won the war. And he was given this big land grant. And so he started a town called Oldenbarneveld, and he built his house. And, he had his, sort of, I don't know what, people popped up around him. So anyways, we felt like, wow, we're living in the mansion, but we couldn't get a Big Mac when we went to McDonald's. Like, we had to get a regular hamburger. Like, my dad wouldn't spend the money on a Big Mac. And we're just like, what? It doesn't make any sense. And it's to this day, right? I go back to the summer house, and I'm like, the place is falling apart. It's like, Dad, why don't you invest in this place to, to make it nice? And the boats are always broken because he won't buy a new boat. It's like, that's a poverty mindset. You know what I mean? Even though it's got all this wealth. It's so weird. But it's not uncommon,
How do you come up against that? Though? Like now, do they? Because I feel like it can be hard when you evolve away from your family, and then when you go home, like there's some funny stuff, right? Like
really hard, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
Face it, everybody grows apart from their family, but if you grow up in a dysfunctional family with trauma, and you get healing, like you are on a healing path, then it's very, very re-triggering to go back into those environments, right? There was a really very, very beloved kind of AA/therapist who talked a lot about those dysfunctional family systems, and the metaphor, his name John Bradshaw, the metaphor he uses like a mobile, like mobile that kind of everything's kind of hanging in balance. And when you leave, let's say Mark's hanging over here, and then all of a sudden I leave and I blast off and join the Navy SEALs, and they're like, tried like heck to get me to come back, to plug me back in the mobile, because when I leave, the mobile kind of shifts and everything's out of balance, but in their minds, psychologically, they hold that spot open for me. And there's this deep psychological need to put me back in that spot so that everything goes back the way they thought was the perfect balance. And so, years go by and I never come back, but then I get a lot of healing and have a lot of insight and, a lot of forgiveness, a lot of love. So I want to be in their lives. Then I go back, and then they like put me right back in there where I was at 16 or 15. And it's just like all this energy just starts being triggered in you. And it's very hard because those patterns, or what the yogis would call samskaras, are grooved so deeply. And you could work on them for 40 or 50 years and they'll still be triggered. So that's, part of the practice is to recognize that you can't fix the human condition. You just have to, this is the difference between like Western psychotherapy and Buddhism, is you have to just be okay with things as they are, and to recognize that that's just okay. Like, you're perfect the way you are. Whereas the Western model is kind of like the Western model of action that you were talking about: do, goal. And I'm going to go fix myself, right? So I'm going to do tons of therapy, I'm an EMDR and this and that and the other thing. And then you go home thinking, I'm fine, I got this, and then bam, a bomb goes off, and you're like, I thought I was a lot more evolved than that. And now I feel like I'm, you know what I mean? I'm like, in order to handle this, I got to like down a bottle of wine just to get to the starting line. It's like, and I'm sure everyone listening who's been who was raised in those situations going like, yep. So, there's no real good solution. Of course, boundaries, and so we do that. We try that, and, limited contact. But the best is just forgiveness for yourself and for them. Just pure forgiveness. That's the only real solution.
My mentor is many, but one of them is a psychotherapist that he realized at the age of 50 he was still crazy. He's almost Aspergerish. He's very well learned, and he went and lived with a Swami in India originally to study the Swami psychology, but he became a student, and it was Vedanta. And he always tells me, he says that Western psychology has it wrong because they try to use the personality to fix the personality.
Yeah.
Right. In terms of it's completely, you just getting lost in more confusion,
more stories, right?
More stories,
right?
Yes, and you're using stories to alter stories,
right? And you're going back and reliving negative experiences, which fires them up, and actually, you know, those neurological pathways and emotional energetic centers that where the energy is blocked just get reinforced. Yeah. And so, yeah, I agree with you. The only, you know, it's a much better path to allow the energies to just flow with mindfulness, just like recognize the energies when they come up, the feelings when they come up, and allow them to flow as opposed to try to analyze them to death and, you know, stuff the energy back out of you, right? Because that just makes it worse or distorts it further. There is some benefit. There is some benefit. I think there's a benefit in therapy to surface things that then we can work on through forgiveness and through, you know, Eastern practices of meditation and visualization and energy, you know, release. So that I think the two of them have benefit, right, when worked together skillfully.
I agree with you, mate. So I want to talk about your time in the SEALs, because my view, and I may be wrong, is that you're physically gifted. Like you have a physical acumen, which lends yourself well to doing physical shit, right? I mean, to the extent that they called you cyborg, and I'm sure there's reasons for that, right? But what was your view on when you went through SEALs? You graduated as honorman. What was your competitive advantage other than the physicality? Like, and you might reflect on how you grew up, but I'm trying to understand, like, when you reflect on your whole SEALs journey, looking objectively, if you were looking at Mark Divine objectively, what was it about you that enabled you to do so well in that environment?
Oh, that's a great question. So, yes, I was physically fit and adept, skilled physically. You know, I was a competitive athlete and martial artist and triathlete, and I could endure a lot of pain, you know, in that regard. And I had the family of origin stuff where, as I mentioned earlier, you know, a lot of SEAL training, if you look at it on TV, it seems like abuse. And it's because it's kind of modeling that, even though the instructors, most of them are doing it because they care about you. But, you know, it has some elements of abuse and trauma to it because they're trying to like really expose weakness and expose triggers and expose, you know, things that in combat, or if you're, you know, facing an enemy who's not doing it with care or concern, it could cause you to make bad decisions or to you know, have your life lost or the lives of your teammates. And so this is serious business. At any rate, so I had those two things going for me, but guess what, RJ? So did most of the other students. You know, you have to be a physically fit individual and you have to be athletic in order to even get to stand at the starting line, right? That's a prerequisite. And then I would say, I would make the statement, although there's no way to really validate it, that there are a fair number of SEALs who had traumatic childhoods, because I know a lot of them, and a lot of them did, you know. And because when you grow up in dysfunction like that, then you gravitate toward order. And you can't find any more order than in the military. So I was no different. I kind of like looked for that order and I looked for that challenge, and I wanted, and also you grow up kind of feeling like something's off and you want to like burn it out of your system, especially if you're an athlete, right? And a warrior. And like I figured Navy SEALs and Hell Week, that's going to burn it all out. And I'm going to grow and, you know, be a different person. And I did from that, but didn't get to the root of everything like we talked about. So those two things I had. And with those two things alone, I would say there's probably a 95% chance that I still would have graduated with my class. And we had 185 people start and 19 of us graduated. I would have graduated. But what it was that made me exceptional, or maybe a really effective leader, was the meditation. Right? Because the meditation, you know, in 4 years of meditation, especially when I was 21, 22, 23, 24 years old, and my brain was still developing, it opened up my mind to where I could really use my right and left hemisphere simultaneously. So I had a lot of situational awareness, which is right hemispheric thinking, along with the ability to really focus in and concentrate, which is left hemispheric thinking. Furthermore, that when your brain starts to be able to operate at that more whole mind, simultaneous mind level, then you have almost an opening of access to the heart's intelligence and also your gut intelligence, you know, the seat of instinctual intuition as well as heart or empathic intuition. And so I was able to really started to open my heart to my teammates and to really demonstrate, not as an act of transactional, you know, hey, this is good for me, but because I really cared for them, a real kind of advanced level of leadership where I was doing it for them. Right? I was in service to my small team, which was like 6 other guys. We called that a boat crew. And so at the end of that training, and I was like very open with them. I was like, we're going to get through this together, right? This isn't about me, and I'm not in competition with you guys. We're competing to succeed by getting to the finish line. And I taught them some of the skills I had learned on the meditation bench and in karate. You know, I taught them breath control, and I taught them, you know, how to focus more and how to, you know, maintain situational awareness while they're getting beat up. And I taught them how to really stay focused just on the task right in front of them. And, you know, I would cue them verbally to stay positive and never really go negative. And if they did, I would, you know, take action to haul them out. Right. So I taught them all these skills that I just kind of learned through my martial arts training and through Nakamura. And so what ended up happening was I was selected as honor man, which meant that I was good at, I wasn't number 1 at everything, but I was really in the top, you know, 10% at everything or 5%. And yet the thing that really matters with the honor man is your peer evaluations and the instructor evaluations. And so there was another student who was probably had higher scores than me, but those evaluations put me over the edge.
Did the instructors see that during the training? Like, did they see your leadership tendencies, and how did they respond to that? Like, did they antagonize you more, or did they become easier on you? Like, what was their response to that? They
certainly didn't become easier. I think that they started to just give me more space. You know, instructors are very intuitive, right? And when they see a strong team and a strong boat crew, what they're really looking for are the qualities of a great teammate that they are probably going to work beside in the future in combat.
Got it.
So they're there to select their next group of teammates. And so when they see a good officer and a good group of operators who get it and who are great teammates and are, you know, understand the mission and don't complain, are super positive, they will leave them alone. It doesn't mean the training is any easier, but in a sense, it might be, because on the flip side, if they see weakness or if they see ego, you know, or they see an officer not taking care of his guys or anything, like there could be any number of things, then they descend on that individual and that boat crew, you know, en masse, and they begin to really poke and prod and ride them and to try to, you know, ferret out what this weakness is so that they can learn from it. And a lot of times that leads to people quitting and not succeeding. And also, you know, you could get kind of beat up. Also, if you don't have the skill to really manage your energy and to maintain your physical structure, even if you're a great athlete, you know, it's another thing where you could really go into a downward spiral quickly because, you know, let's say you're on a long run and you're in the bottom quarter of the class because you haven't managed your energy well. Guess what? They take that bottom quarter and they take them to the surf zone and they do, you know, drills, you know, FF drills with them for a while, you know, and then they make you catch up to the class, right? So you get extra work, and that could set you further behind if that happens all the time.
Right.
So my entire boat crew graduated with me. So out of the 19 graduates, 7 of us, right, were a team. So there was something that we were doing a little bit differently. Which is pretty cool.
I find your psychological response to the process interesting. I've looked at, and I love him. I love Goggins, but I looked at his psychological response, and he effectively rebelled against the instructors, and it was, to your earlier point, it represented the trauma. I think that's why he did well, because I think he was deeply traumatized, and
right.
he knew how to respond to that. And I think where he couldn't round out was that next level of what you're talking about.
I know David, he's a great guy. He was trying to prove to himself that he was worthy. And because his trauma is so deep, he went overboard to prove it, through Navy SEAL training and then through becoming this ultra endurance athlete. And so there's a point in time where you just have to accept that you're worthy and not have to prove it anymore. And then also, to use your term, to round out the hard with the soft, because eventually you just run into a wall or off a cliff, right? There's just a time to stop running and to start, nurturing your, the yin, the softer side, right? So we have this metaphor that I use when I teach SEALFIT trainees. It's like, when the tsunami comes, would you rather be the mighty oak or the willow, or the little reed, And so the point is that we can be the strongest weightlifter, 400-pound deadlift. You can be the freaking boxing champion. You can do all that hard stuff, and that's going to be great, right? You might even make it through buds. But when the real shitstorm comes, right, you might need to have that soft flexibility, pliability, and relaxation skills, and be able to let go like the reed, and to be able to just lay down for a while and then come back up. So the highest form of leadership is combining the hard with the soft and training them both until they become integrated into one thing. Yeah. That's actually represented in the yin yang symbol. If you remember the Eastern symbol, well, when you have a white dot in the black area, which is the yang, but the white dot represents the stillness in action, which is the yin. And then in the white side, which represents the yin, or the receptivity, the stillness, you have a black dot, which represents action. And so that's this idea that there's action in inaction, and there's inaction in action. And ultimately, we want to find that simultaneity of the hard and the soft, the yin and the yang, the situational awareness and the focus, right? In everything. That's mastery level.
That's being able to hold different and varying views and energies, and be with it and do what's needed, right? And having that emotional agility, that growth mindset, the ability to be agile, which really is that 1% that everyone can develop. I mean, it's easier for people to develop, to your point, particularly within the SEAL environment where everyone is already physically there. But it's that ability to then go into that gray area of fluidity, of being and state management, which really set you apart, I think.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. When you develop this way, you also are much more comfortable with complexity. So if you're just kind of a linear left-minded person, then you do live on this, this polarity scale, good, bad, right, wrong. Whereas when you develop the hard and the soft, the yin yang, and in an integrated whole-minded manner, then you're much more comfortable in the complexity. And you see that every situation has many, many different reasons for coming about, if not an infinite number of reasons for coming about. Just this idea of cause and effect is a mirage. And that when you learn to take and make different perspectives, then you come up with solutions that are from a higher order than you would if you're just using the linear left brain.
Yeah. I find that in business as well. Like, I'm naturally an impulsive person, but I find I can feel in my body when situations and problems and ambiguity arises. I work with startups. There's ambiguity all the time. I leverage impulse when required, action, but I also leverage standing back and observing the playing field. It's not always easy, and it takes a lot of discipline to do so. But I think that I've only been able to evolve that through mindfulness, reflection,
right?
Being quiet and still, right?
Right.
So I definitely agree with you. So you ultimately get out of the Navy. It was a decision I think you made to put your marriage first, right? From what I understand, it was you're touring, you're never home.
Yeah.
You decide to do SEALFIT. What was?
By the way, I didn't get out of the Navy entirely. I got off active duty and I stayed in the reserve force. There's a few hundred Navy SEAL reservists, and so I got into that. And I actually had some of the most interesting work as a reserve officer. You know, mobilized twice, went to war in Iraq, and so that was pretty cool. But generally speaking, when you're a reservist, you're working either on the weekend, 1 weekend a month, or the way I did it was I did about 40 days every year, except for the years that I got mobilized, you know, because of the Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns and whatnot. Slight distinction. But when I got off active duty in 1997, I was able to, you know, basically do something else full time, mostly full time. It's kind of nice.
And how did the SEALFIT idea come about? Like, what was the origination of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my first business was a brewing company, Coronado Brewing Company, right? And that was very successful. In fact, today it's just massively successful. But I take a lot of credit for starting it. You know, I raised all the money and got it up.
Was it beer?
Yeah,
beer.
We were the fourth microbrewery and a beer restaurant in San Diego.
Wow.
But I didn't choose wisely with my partners. And so I ended up in a real clash with these partners. We'd had completely different values and vision for the business. And these guys ended up being really mean. And they were my brothers-in-law. And they started to really mess with the family because of, you know, they didn't agree with the decisions I was making to try to grow the business and bring shareholder value back to the shareholders. They had a whole different plan.
Yeah, right.
So it got to a point where that got so painful, and my wife's parents got divorced over it, and I was the mom blamed me, the brothers blamed me, and I just said, you know, or Sandy, my wife, just begged me. She said, just walk away. So I organized a buyout where they bought me out, and so I basically turned the business over to them and went off and did a few other things. And during that time, I had also registered the domain name NavySeals.com for $35. And
what a great registry. What a great result.
I know. So by the way, if anyone wants to buy that, contact me, because I'm totally open to selling it. I think the Navy should buy it from me.
Yeah, right.
And so I started to train people in the forums and sell gear on NavySeal.com. And it wasn't enough to support me, so I was also doing some other entrepreneurial things. I was like interim CEO for a software company, and I helped a bunch of other startups. And I was really had this idea that, you know, because of my experience as starting that business and NavySeal.com, you know, I could become maybe a venture investor and also you know, help entrepreneurs and be an entrepreneur. And then I got mobilized to go to Iraq, and so I brought in my son-in-law to help, and he was a web developer, to help with NavySeals.com or to keep it going while I was over there. And before that, I was doing that. Plus, I was at University of San Diego in a doctoral program in leadership, and getting paid as a professor, adjunct professor, and to help start a leadership institute. So I was doing a lot. But I had to set aside all the academic stuff and the PhD when I got recalled to go to Iraq. So while I was over in Iraq, I had an amazing experience. And I had kind of an epiphany, and I said, you know what, I really want to teach. I want to train leaders and develop leaders and not teach leadership academically. So I decided not to go back to USD and to finish my PhD. And just so happens that my son-in-law, Rich, was also able to, either just because of the momentum we had or because of his skills, was able to double our revenue in NavySeal.com while I was in Iraq. So it's like this year goes by and I'm like, my business has doubled. It's now doing almost $1 million. And I didn't even lift a finger. I was like, oh, I think there's a real business here. So I went back when I got off that year of active duty. I went and started really focusing on that business. Well, simultaneously, the Navy had invited me down to, because I had some skills, unique skills in developing complex training, right? And so they had, while I was in active duty, I helped develop this complex, really scenario-driven training for SEAL task units that they would take before they went over to the war. And I ran it, I think, like 3 or 4 times, put platoons, even like Jocko's platoon through it before he deployed and whatnot. It was a big team effort, but I was the officer in charge. So when I got off active duty, the SEALs asked me to come and do that, continue doing that. They wanted me to stay on active duty, and I said no. And they wanted me to do it. If I couldn't do an active duty, then they wanted me to do it as a contractor for someone else, for another company. And I said, no, I will do it if you hire my company.
Yeah.
And so I filed a DBA called US Tactical and which owned NavySeal.com. So it was NavySeal.com, but it was just, so I got hired by US Tactical to run these programs for the SEALs for a couple of years. And then I parlayed that into launching a nationwide mentoring program for SEAL candidates, which is a government contract led by the US Navy. And I did that for 1 year, but this $1 billion company led by another SEAL named Eric Prince, the company's called Blackwater, had wanted that contract. And when they didn't win it, and I was a subcontractor who won it, they went to town to try to get it back or to get it. And they ended up succeeding, through very fraudulent means. And so I had this contract, which was like a $10 million, 6-year contract that's literally just ripped out from under me. And I had a lot of my advisors were saying, you got to fight this, protest this thing. And I went back to my meditation bench and I said, you know what? After a few days of meditating on it, I said, I'm not going to fight. It's like a minnow fighting a freaking whale shark, or killer shark. And I said, I didn't really enjoy the government contracting business anyways. I got some great skills, but I do love developing leaders. So why don't I parlay this into developing special ops leaders? And I already have NavySeal.com, and I'm already training a lot of Spec Ops guys through the forums. So everything started to come together in my mind. It's like, oh, well, I'm already doing this. Well, I don't need to be in a government contract and paid by the government. I don't need to have one client. I need to have thousands or hundreds of clients. So I launched SEALFIT. And SEALFIT was not a government contracting. I stopped doing that. I said, I'll never do that again. And so I put together program. The other thing about this, like the Navy really wouldn't let me do anything that I wanted to do. Like I wanted to teach them meditation and visualization and breath control training, all the things that had worked for me. They said, no, we just want you to corral the guys at the pool and beat them up and, get them to pass the screening test better,
Were they doing box breathing, Mark, or did you bring that?
I brought that into the SEALs. Okay. They weren't doing anything like that.
Okay, right.
And when I started SEALFIT and started teaching the SEALs, I had the freedom, because it was a civilian company. I had the freedom to develop a training program that I knew would work. And so I ran these 30-day live-in academies called the SEALFIT Academy, which is like a Shaolin monastery for Spec Ops guys. And during that 30 days, I would teach everything I had learned and everything I was scraping. I became this inveterate learner, just like you, like everything to do with optimal performance, peak performance. And this is still pretty early in those days because it's 2006. But I had like 20 some odd years of training as a martial artist. I had taken up yoga, deep yoga with hundreds of hours of certification training in 1999, and now this is 2006. So I started to draw from those traditions, from the Eastern traditions, martial tradition, yoga, and I started to learn psychotherapy. My wife is a therapist. And I started to learn philosophy and integral theory, and I was just an inveterate reader. And so I was able to start to pull together a system of physical, mental, emotional, intuitive, and spiritual training that I built into SEALFIT. And I called it the 5-mountain path, 5-mountain training. Now, the SEAL candidates who trained with me, 90% of them get through SEAL training, which is compared to 80% or more washout rate for everyone else. And so the SEALs started to pay attention, right? And now, about 10 years later, I'm now about 16 years in, about 6 or 7 years ago, I learned that they were starting to teach what I now call unbeatable mind principles and recommending my book down at Buzz. And that was a huge, very gratifying to see. And a lot of SEALs now have trained with things like box breathing and mindfulness and visualization and whatnot. Some of it just because the instructors picked it up from us, or some, it just started to get out there more. And now they use those skills. They never used it or taught them when I was at Buzz.
Who paid you, Mark? So the individuals wanted to join this?
Individuals paid me. Yeah, I've never been paid by the government since I lost that government contract back in 2006.
Right. So these were people that were in the Navy that wanted to join the SEALs, that wanted an edge.
Some in the Navy, but a lot of them were pre-Navy. They were candidates, or they were in another service, like they were Marines who wanted to cross over. Right. But also it wasn't just Navy. We had Green Berets, we had Rangers, we had Air Force Pararescue, we had Australian SAS, British SAS, SBS. We had Canadians. We had French. We had Germans. It was wild, right? The heyday of SEALFIT, and we were all over the news. We had elite CrossFitters coming and doing our training. The most famous training that we had, and I mentioned it earlier, I think, was well, maybe I didn't, but at the end of this 30-day event, the graduation ceremony was 50 hours of nonstop around the clock training. And that was modeled after Hell Week. And so over the years, I really couldn't hold on to that 30-day event because it was just too much. I didn't have the personal capacity to keep doing that. So, and we weren't charging enough money in the business model. So I started to break that into smaller pieces. And one of the pieces was these crucibles, right? And so we still run those to this day 3 times a year, where we have a 6, 12, 24-hour, and 50-hour crucible. And this nonstop, really intense physical, mental, emotional team training. It's just extraordinary training. So we got kind of a worldwide reputation for that. And that was cranking up until, COVID. And then that slowed us down quite a bit. So now I'm coming back at it and trying to take another look and say, what is SEALFIT going to look like for the next 10 or 20 years? And how is it going to exist without Mark? Because, I don't want to run it forever. They should have a young gun in there, right? So I'm looking at ideas to raise money, bring some other team guys in and special operators, and grow our coaching base of non-special operators with the unbeatable mind model. And we're going through all that right now, trying to figure that out. As you know, it's not easy because it's like I have to treat it again like another startup, because what we did before in the past isn't going to get us where we want to go in the future.
I'm definitely interested in learning more about that journey, Mark, because it'd be great to get some stuff like that down here in Australia. Do you do much in Australia? Yeah.
We've never done any events in Australia, but we've had a ton of Australians come up here to our training. That's part of what I'm trying to figure out. There was a while I was going down the path of certifying coaches, but they really needed to be special operators if they were going to be the head coach or business owner. And that, I didn't have that model dialed in. And that's what I'm working on now. And so I pulled back from that because I didn't want a civilian to be running a SEALFIT business. Right. So then I actually created the Unbeatable brand, and I have 400 certified coaches in the Unbeatable brand. But because of that, I've taken a lot of the energy away from SEALFIT. And so I really want to re-energize SEALFIT, because I think the world really needs physical and mental toughness, right? And so our SEALFIT is really a strong body, strong mind, strong team. And I see that the world needs this more than ever, even more than in 2006 when I started.
Yeah. Well, I think what we'll do, Mark, is we'll start to land the plane, mindful of time. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. One of the reasons one of the reasons I really enjoy your work is your range. You're academic, you're intellectual, but you're physical, and you're also spiritual. And I really enjoy that. And people asked me what it was like talking to you after the first interview that we did, which couldn't go live because of the issues. I just didn't realize how complex you are. You know, like there's a lot of going on there. And
working on the simplicity on the other side of that complexity.
Well, I don't mean it in a bad way. What I mean is there's just a lot to unpack.
Right.
And I really recommend to our audience to go and check out the Unbeatable Mind. One of my favorite principles in there is the 5 plateau of consciousness, the key themes of that. That's just excellent stuff. And yeah, just really want to thank you for your time on the show, Mark. Thank you. Want to ask you before we go, where could our audience learn more about you, man?
Well, a comprehensive kind of catch-all is my personal website, markdevine.com. So there I have my books and also my podcast, which is called The Mark Devine Show. And I have a weekly newsletter that heads out every Tuesday with my blog and with the show notes and stuff like that. And so you can subscribe to that at that site, and also my social media handles. And then SEALFIT.com, is where we do these, this intense Navy SEAL style physical, mental team training. And then unbeatablemind.com is the coaching program using the 5 mountain, 5 plateau model of integrated vertical development, whole person development.
And before we go, we always ask our guests if there's any key habits or there's anything that you'd like to leave our audience with. What would your one piece of advice or, a piece of advice be?
If you're not training your mind, someone else is training it for you, and the results will speak for themselves. So start to train your mind and body today and make it as important as eating and sleeping. It's that important.
I agree.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, RJ.
Thank you, Mark.